welcome to part 2 of our ILooK series, the best ways to use KICS for short and long-term case management. Our presenters today are John Sedoski and Scott Pancoast. They are two of our computer crime specialists with NW3C. For those of you who don't know much about what we do, we provide nationwide support for law enforcement and regulatory agencies involved in the prevention, investigation, and prosecution of economic and high-tech crimes. We conduct original research on all facets of white-collar crime and deliver training in computer forensics, cyber and financial crime investigations, and intelligence analysis. Also, just want to let you know that the recording of the first webinar is posted to YouTube. It's at NW3C.org/ILooKIX. I think that's it for me. So John and Scott, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you everyone. So today what we're going to be going over, the best ways to use KICS for short and long-term case management. A couple other things I want to give note to is Perlustro is the company behind ILooKIX, and you'll hear Scott and I refer to ILooKIX also as KICS, so just FYI. Also, ILooKIX, for some of us that do not know, it's a full forensic tool. And if you go to Perlustro.com, you can read more about what ILooKIX can do. NW3C also is the training provider for ILooKIX, or KICS, and you can read more information about when an ILooK class will be in your area, or if you're interested in hosting, you can go to NW3C's website and under the commercial products, look and see when a ILooK class will be held. Also on Perlustro's website, there's a forum for all ILooK users, so that way you can post questions that you may have about the tool or suggestions on how to use the tool, so sign up for the forums. So the first thing that we're going to be going over today is how to create a virtual hard disk with VHD attached for our short-term case management. The second part we'll be going over is how to export and import our ILooK archive from within KICS for our long-term case management. So think about it this way. Here's a good analogy on why to use a VHD. With a library and a card catalog, if you had a brand new library, placing new cards in the card catalog would be very easy and quick to do.
The library is like the file system, right?
Yeah, the library is just like our file system, and we need a place to put those cards quickly. And whenever we place a card in the card catalog, one at a time, it doesn't take very much time. But if you have 20 or 30,000 cards or 20 or 30,000 files coming in at one time, it's going to take time just to put them in consecutively, let alone if we're using our current forensic systems MFT, where then you would have to find different places to put those files. And that's going to take even longer to do so. So how can we solve these problems? Obviously, by creating a VHD, we can solve this problem. So with our VHD, it's a virtual hard disk. It's a brand new virtual hard drive that's been added to the system that has a brand new MFT. A brand new MFT allows for files to be saved consecutively after another. So that way there's no searching for an empty entry to save a file to.
On an initial file system on a computer, what is it, 20, 30,000 files?
Yeah.
A couple 300,000 files, depending on what you've installed?
Yeah. So by having a brand new slate, we can save the files that our processing is going to be doing and ultimately free up our resources from our system. We also get a few other benefits. First, it's, like I said, a brand new file system, which is empty and faster for file system response. It's also a standalone file system, because if you use your current forensic computer, the indexing may already be turned on. And by indexing all of those small files that will be created, It's going to take time and also slow down your file system speed. You also have another benefit. All your case data is all together inside the VHD, and this also helps with file contamination to be reduced. But VHD isn't the standalone method. There's other things that we can do as well. We could use a brand new hard drive that's been wiped and formatted for each case. And the great thing about ILooKIX is it can run on a fast laptop, something that you buy off the shelf and run. Or if you have the resources and the funding, and you have a forensic machine that has a drive bay that allows you to plug in hard drives, you could use a standalone hard drive for each case. Instead of having a virtual hard drive, you would actually have a physical hard drive and still get the same benefits like we have with the VHD. It's just a trade-off. What resources do you have to use? Another thing that you could do is increase the MFT zone within the partition, but this will slow down your system.
Basically what we're doing there is just adding more card catalogs, right?
We're just adding more card catalogs, absolutely. And an even riskier method would also be to increase the cluster size from 4K to 8K during formatting. So let's create a VHD, and we're going to use VHD attach. There's two links Scott's going to post in the Q&A. If you decide that VHD attach isn't for you, you can use your Microsoft operating system and create a VHD. And the two websites Scott's going to give you, one is a document that has step-by-steps on how to create a VHD within disk management, and the other is just a YouTube video on how to do it. So if you like to read, you can follow the first one, or if you like to watch a video, you can watch the second one. So I'm going to open up VHD attach, and what I'm going to do is just create a new VHD. So with VHD attach open, I'm going to come up to new, and I have some options. VHDs are limited to 2 terabytes in size. So that's why I'm going to choose just right below the 2 terabyte threshold, or the 2,000 gigabyte threshold. And I chose to use 10 based instead of 1024 because it's easier to max out that 2 terabyte limit. The thing that you really must focus on is the type. You want to choose dynamically expanding. Whenever you create the VHD and its 2 terabyte limit, by selecting dynamic, it's going to allow you to save up to 2 terabytes of information. But if you choose fixed, it's going to take 2 terabytes and save 2 terabytes of data to your hard drive.
So basically it starts out with the smallest file, smallest area, and expands as needed?
Absolutely, Scott. It's going to start out with the bare minimum, and then it will be able to grow up to that threshold that we're going to set as 2 terabytes. VHDX, once that becomes available, or it is available, it exceeds the 2 terabyte limit. So VHDX exceeds the 2 terabyte limit. So I'm satisfied with all my selections, so I'm going to create my VHD. And now it's going to ask me for a place to save it. Here I'm going to go ahead and save it in my folder for our webinar, but if you're following along later, obviously you could save it wherever you need to save it. And how I'm going to name my file is also important for case management. With working with VHDs and with ILooKIX, we want to make sure we remember, once we give it a drive letter, what drive letter it was given. That way we don't have any problems with ILooKIX. So a good naming convention that I use and I recommend is starting the file name with the drive letter you're going to assign the VHD to. So here I'm going to assign this VHD to V, so my case name I'm going to start with V and then followed by whatever my case is going to be. So this will be where you could name it uniquely for your case that you're working on. So I'm going to name it Case Management Demo and save. Now notice here, if we mistakenly have selected fixed, it's warning us, hey, this is going to take up 2 terabytes and you only have 14 gigs free. Well, if you move out of the way, the screen out of the way, you can see, okay, I selected dynamically, I'm good. It's going to be able to grow up to that amount, and I didn't accidentally selected fixed size. So I'm going to go ahead and click yes to continue. And now it's creative. Well, with a brand new hard disk that's in the system virtually, it needs to format. So let's go ahead and format our disk. And here is where we want to make sure we continue our same naming convention. So my volume label is going to be the same thing as my VHD. So here I would have V underscore and then my name of the case. So keeping that same naming convention. And I'm going to go ahead and click Start and OK. And a good naming convention is good for many different reasons. One that comes to mind is if multiple people or agencies are working on the case, you want a name that is unique and not generic, such as the Johnson case. Well, Johnson, Smith, all those other common names are common, and you may have multiple cases with that. Johnson 1, Johnson 2 is not very unique. That way, if you happen to give this to another person or agency to work on, or someone else comes in, they know which case to select to continue working with in ILooKIX. So the format's complete. I'm going to go ahead and close this screen for formatting. And now I am ready to go ahead and attach my VHD. Because currently we just created the VHD, but now we need to attach it to our system. So I'm going to go ahead and click Attach. And with the VHD attached up, I need to change it to my drive letter that we had named our VHD. Notice currently it is given the letter E because that was the next available drive letter. But if you come up to Tools and hit the arrow, we can change our drive letter. So we want to change our drive letter to V and click Change. The other option, and the thing that I like about VHD Attach, if you notice under the Tools, you have the option to mount upon startup. And you have the same option within Windows, but within Windows it's a little bit more difficult to create because you have to go through and create an event and you have to have a script. Here it's simply a toggle. So if you wanted to mount upon startup, you would toggle and the check mark would come on. And this is good for if you happen to forget to mount the VHD, ILooKIX will not work if the VHD isn't mounted. So it'll throw an error. And it's just, for me, it's a good habit that I always have select or have mounted upon startup, so that way, if I happen to forget, it's one less step I have to do. Is it necessary? No. You can attach and detach by simply attaching and detaching the file, and you will see whenever I show you the file, simply right-clicking, attach and detach as well. So now that we have our drive letter changed, and we can see that change here on the screen to V, what we now need to do is change the permission settings and also turn off indexing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my Windows Explorer, and we can see over here on the left we now have our virtual hard disk, and it has the drive letter V and also V in the label. But what we need to do is right-click our drive and go to Properties. And on the very first tab under General, if you notice, what's on by default is indexing. So what we want to do is we want to uncheck where it says Allow files on this drive to have contents indexed. We want to uncheck that, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier with SQL Server creating thousands upon thousands of small temporary files. If indexing is turned on, it's going to index those and take up our system resources and ultimately slow down our processing. And we don't want that. So we want to uncheck and come over and hit Apply. And the reason why we do this now is that way we don't have to come back and do it later and cascade the permissions to every object. Because right now, there isn't anything inside the VHD. If there was any objects, this is the option that you would want to choose, so that way it would cascade the permissions to all the subfolders and files within the VHD. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now indexing is turned off. The next thing we need to do is we need to come up to the Security tab, and we need to make sure we have permissions set for our user who has ILooK installed. So right now, my current user, or my ILooK user, does not currently have full control. So we need to change that. So in order to change permissions, we need to come and select the Edit button, find that current user, and come down to the permissions for the user and select Full Control and hit Apply. So now the user that has ILooK installed has full control. The other user that needs full control is authenticated users. Now, if authenticated users is not available under this groups or user names, so let me remove authenticated users. You would need to add authenticated users. So you'd select the Add button, and where we see the flashing cursor, here's where you would type authenticated users. Well, for me, if I don't have spell check, I'm not very good at spelling. But I know the first 4 letters of the user authenticated. So if I were just to type in the first couple letters and come over to check name, it knows, hey, there's a user, authenticated user, is this the one you want? That is the one I want, and I'm going to click OK. It now adds authenticated user back to the list, and with authenticated user selected, I can now check full control for authenticated users and click Apply and click OK. So now that I've turned off indexing and gave full control to my user that has ILooK installed and also my authenticated user, I'm ready to start a case. So I'm going to finish clicking OK. I'm going to go ahead and close that window, and I'm going to bring ILooK up. So we created our VHD, we allowed it to be dynamic, we have a good naming convention, so that way we know what drive letter it should have, and that'll be important for whenever we point our control point within ILooKIX to that VHD. Now we turned off indexing, and we also gave permissions. We're going to start a new case. For this, starting a new case, I'm going to demonstrate things and go completely through all the steps. But for the majority of this, it's going to be like a cooking demonstration that we see on the Food Network. They put something in the oven, come back from a commercial, and it's already done for us. Because I don't need to sit and wait for the case to be processed with all the bells and whistles turned on. So whenever we get to that point, I'll let you know, and then we'll show you the finished product. So with iLook open, I'm going to come up to case, and we're going to start a new case. Standard info, the first tab for our case setup wizard. The mandatory fields that must be filled in are case name and also case description. So here for our case name, I'm just going to do case management demo, and for case description, our demo for our webinar. And obviously, if you're creating a case back in your office, the case name and case description should be uniquely identifiable per your department's policy naming conventions, or something that if someone else comes along, they understand what the case is based off the case name. Case description, here's where you can name what type of case it might be, and if you have case notes or you have an investigator that gave you certain notes, you could place here, and also the start case started on. Going to the next tab, our case group, here's where you can create a case group and give it a name. So here, if you have multiple cases that you would consider high-dollar crimes, such as cigarettes from Virginia being sold in New York. So we have, or believe it or not, Legos. People have been stealing Legos, or not really stealing them from the store, but taking pictures of cheaper barcodes and putting them on the high-dollar Legos to buy them cheaper and selling them for a profit. So those could be considered high-dollar crimes, and you can make a case group for that and go from there.
You can also do violent crimes?
Violent crimes doesn't have to be high-dollar crimes like I gave. Anything that you could categorize or group together your cases, that's a function. And you can add, delete, or edit them under the case group tab. Case investigator. Here's where, if you're the only investigator, you can add your investigator. If it was a different agency or different section, you could add that information here. You could add multiple investigators and have them selected here, and that all goes into the case log. Case control point. This is the crescendo of why we created our VHD and prepped everything. Here, under the case control point, is where you'll navigate out to your VHD. So under the computer, our expanding computer, we see our V drive, our V case management demo. You cannot just select the root of the drive and click OK. You must create a folder within the VHD. And that folder, I'm going to name it Control Point, because it is my control point, and all of the case data is going to be saved in there. And I'll show you what iLook creates, all the folder structure and the SQL databases that are saved to the control point as soon as we create our folder and click OK. Default categories. Categories are already built into iLook, but if you have a proprietary or something you're looking for in particular, you can create a category, and it's just prepping your workspace so that way you don't have to do it after the case is loaded. Say you have a 2 terabyte drive that you're waiting to process, it's been a long weekend, you're working double shifts, and you forget what category you wanted to create. Well, here you can create it right now on the spot, and that way when it's finished up, start categorizing certain file or file types to that category.
Or how about evidence, potential leads, other stuff to follow up on?
Yeah, those are great examples, Scott, with evidence, potential leads. Those could be categories that you create. So now that I have all my case information set up, my control point pointed to, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. What is that? Oops, the case name. We go back and change the case name in case I had one already in there.
Change the folder name.
Let me just bear with me right one quick. There we go. Just a minor technical difficulty. So we have our control point now pointed to for our case. And let's minimize our iLook. And I'm going to bring up our case control point inside our VHD and show you this is all that was created once we started our case. We haven't added any evidence, we hadn't done any processing, but these are the folder structures and the databases that are created for SQL and for iLook to work. And if we notice the size, right now it takes up 3.5 gigs of data for all the prepping for the SQL database and all the folder structure. So now that our case has been created, we need to add a piece of evidence. So I'm going to come up to Evidence, Add Image, and if you've already created an image, once you select the image, it will populate certain information. So I selected my image, and my standard info has now been populated with my media name and also my media description. This is because I used IXimager to create this image, and this was the information that I had typed in whenever I created the image. Under auto processing, I have already done this. So this is where I put my casserole in the oven, and then when we come back from a quick commercial break, I'll have it already finished.
The cooking show process.
My cooking show process, yeah. The image that I used was a 2 gig thumb drive. It had a 1 gig of information on it, and I checked everything that you see here on the screen. It took about 12 minutes to demo. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this out because we don't need to wait 12 minutes to go through. I'm going to go ahead and close my case, and I already have my VHD with my finalized case and everything processed here. So like I said earlier, once you have your VHD, if you notice on my screen or your screen, once you right-click, you have the option to do certain things with VHDs. So here's where I'm going to right-click my VHD and click Attach. So if you didn't like that auto-mount feature that I talked about earlier, just finding where your VHD is stored, right-clicking and Attach is all that it takes. And if you notice over here on the right, I now have my W case, my finalized.
That's added in with the VHD attached program, that function, correct?
Yeah, that function is. Within Windows, you would have to go and just follow the 2 links that I gave you, and it shows you how to attach and detach VHDs. So now that I have my final casserole finished, I'm going to come up to Case and open up my webinar demo.
That looks like a good organizational structure for case blocks.
I have different things that I work on. I wish I could work on high-dollar crimes and Legos. So here's my webinar demo. Here's my piece of evidence, and everything's been processed. And for those of you who may have not had the chance to use iLook, like I said, we go through and we have a 5-day training course on how to use the tool. And some of these things that I'm going through, maybe I'm going over them quicker than I normally would if I were teaching the actual training that we do. And if that's the case, at the end of the webinar, there'll be a survey. And if that's of interest to you to have a training for the tool, obviously let us know so that way we can get in contact with you.
NW3C.org.
Yes, NW3C.org. So here's my case. So my short-term case management, I'm done going over. We stepped you through everything. Now, what happens whenever case closed? What do we do? How do we archive our information that we just created? Because for this instance, it was a 1 gig thumb drive and it took 12 minutes, or 2 gig thumb drive and it took 12 minutes to process. But some of you guys may encounter terabytes worth of information that take maybe days to process. You don't want to have to redo that processing over again if you've already finished it. So with ILooKIX, you can actually export an archive file that has all that information. Because if we notice, before, when we created our VHD, it was 3.5 gigs without anything in it. So if I were to go and look at my processed VHD, it went up 120 megabytes. Not a whole lot, but it still took time to do. So why not be able to archive it? And we can do that within ILooKIX. And how we can do that is simply, we'd have to close the case. And with the case closed, if you come up to Case and you come down to Manage, you now have the list of all your cases that you're currently working on. So ours was the webinar demo. Now we have the option to export our case. And what that's going to do is it's going to make an iLook archive file, and it's going to contain all of the information that you see on the screen. It's going to zip it up into an iLook archive file for us. So that way we can, what we'll show you here after I show you how to export, import it in very easily. So with the webinar demo selected, I'm going to select Export, and here's where you have the option to save your archive file too. So maybe you might have a NAS or some type of external drive that you save it out to. Here's where I would recommend saving it out to, but maybe prepping the folder name to represent the naming convention that you had your VHD also, so that way you keep with that good naming convention.
Later, when you need to bring the case back, this gives you an idea how it's going to come back in the system.
Yeah.
Like, you need to have a specific drive letter, make it part of the case name, so you can see this beforehand.
Absolutely, Scott. That's why we stress having the drive letter in the VHD name, so that way if you need to, you can remember easily what drive letter it was. So I'm going to go ahead and save my iLook archive file, and it gives you the option to password protect if you need to. So I do not need to have it password protected, but obviously if that's part of your policy or something that you already practice, by all means you can have a password or a phrase on there. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And it's going to take about a minute to do this.
Is this archive compressed?
This archive is compressed. So in fact, if you had a 7-zip program, WinZip or 7-zip program, you could decompress the iLook archive file and get the information.
When you bring it back, iLook automatically decompresses it?
Yep. So after this is finished, we're going to step you through how to import. And what iLook does, it decompresses on the fly and creates or saves out all of those folders and SQL databases that I showed you early on.
Now, how does this compare in size for storage of data?
Size for storage, that's a great question, Scott. Let me bring up, once it saves, I'm going to bring up my window here, and I'll show you a couple things. So here is the iLook archive file right now. It was 116 megs. All right, so if we were just to save this and our evidence, evidence was 2 gigs, here's 116 megs. Okay, that's relatively small, but on the grand scheme of things, you could have a very large piece of evidence, and then the iLook archive is relatively smaller. But if you notice, here's my VHD. VHD has the same information, but it's not compressed. And it's 250 megs larger than the iLook archive. And then here I have it 7-zipped. So what I did was I detached my VHD and I 7-zipped the VHD, and it is actually the smallest for archiving. However, there is a trade-off. You cannot just import a 7-zip or a zipped file into iLook. So what you would need to do is, if you're worried about space, say you don't have the funds to go out and keep buying larger hard drives to store, here you could save your VHD by compressing it, and it's going to be the smallest size. However, what you would have to do is decompress the 7-zip and then have your VHD, and that's going to take some time. So the middle of the road would be to use your iLook archive, where it's not the largest, like we see here with our VHD, and it's not the smallest with our zipped VHD. It's in the middle of the road. But it's dependent on each individual. So now that our iLook archive file has been created, I'm going to bring up iLook, and since we just archived our file, we no longer need our case from our selection. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the case from the menu. Now, deleting the case does not delete the case data. It just deletes it from the selection that we see here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete our case and just demonstrate on how to export and then finally import the case back in. So you follow the prompt, and after you've deleted a case, obviously you've opened the case, closed the case multiple times, and in order for us to import the case back in, we'll have to close iLook and then open iLook again. And that would just be you using the tool months or day after day after day, and then finally you have to import the case back in because you have a new lead or you need to get another piece of evidence from it. So if I go to case and open case, obviously it's not there. So what we'll need to do is we would need to come to manage and then come down and import our iLook archive. Now, by default, it goes to the last place you've saved. So obviously, if this wasn't the last place that you've saved, you would need to navigate out to where you saved your iLook archive, select it, and click Open. The thing that you need to do, the control point. We just talked about creating our VHD for our case management, for our short-term case management. Here, I'm just going to create a folder on my machine for our control point. But if this was my actual case and I was importing it back in, just to save time for this webinar, you would create a VHD and step through all the things that I demonstrated at the beginning of the webinar and make that your new control point. Just think of this importing the case back in as a brand new case. So you would want to have that VHD created. But for time's sake, I'm just going to make a folder on my desktop and name it Imported Webinar Demo. And everything that we saw in our VHD that was created is going to be created within this folder. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and click OK here. Now, as long as your evidence item was in the same location from whenever we created our case. So whenever you added your image, let's wait for this to go through. Whenever you start a case and you add your image, you select where your image location is. Whenever you export, it knows that's where that image location is. And as long as it's still there, it'll be able to map everything that from all the processing that you've done. If not, if you've happened to have also archived that image to a different location, ILooK will then prompt you to where the image's new location may be. So now that this has imported, if I come up to Case, Open, I now see my webinar demo. And this is where I was talking, if my image was moved, it would have prompted me so that way it could have mapped appropriately where that new image, or where that image new location is. And you would just select it from there. And that's for your long-term case management. Fairly straightforward, but may just be new information for us and some different steps for us. So that concludes the second portion, the final portion of the webinar, but I just want to go over a recap of what we went over. So for our short-term case management, the most important thing for us that we went over was creating a VHD. And that was simply for the speed for saving our files, MFT overflow, contamination, and what we did with our VHD, we had a naming convention, so I included the drive letter for our naming of our VHD and also our label for our virtual hard drive when we formatted it. We set our permissions for the user that had ILooKIX installed and also for authenticated user to have full control. I then also turned off indexing because we didn't need to index the small temporary files that are going to be created rapidly, so that way we can increase the speed. And that was our short-term case management.
The VHD is there. We're adding it so we can speed up the case processing.
Absolutely.
And when we're talking about a huge number of files, speed's important.
Speed is important, especially when it comes to forensics. Processing can take time. We want it to happen as fast as possible. So if we can do anything on the system to do that, we're going to do it. Now for our long-term case management, once we wrapped up our case and we were ready for it to be done and over with, we created the ILooK archive, and that was simply closing out the case, going to manage, and exporting that case data to an ILooK archive file. The next thing you would obviously do is then, the case is done, you would delete it from the case selection. A couple months down the line, a couple years down the line, you need to revisit that case. We showed you how to import the ILooK archive. And also, we talked about saving the image and also the ILooK archive in the same location, just as a way of good case management. So that way you have everything together for that case. And that was it, folks. So if there was any questions that you had for myself and Scott, Scott's going to go over these.
Try and answer all the questions we can.
Yep.
There are other methods for archiving, correct?
There are other methods for archiving.
If we wanted to, we could go in and literally, like you did, 7-zip up the VHD.
Yep.
If we had this sitting on a separate drive, we could go and hit the control point on that separate drive and store it up and maybe compare or put to the image file with the control point and then store the drive.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. We just chose this one because it was a function of ILooKIX. And like Scott just said, there are a few other ways that you can archive a file. This is one we just thought would be beneficial to all of the ILooKIX users because it is built into the program itself.
It does keep everything in nice, neat order.
Yes.
The other part with using the archive is the control point. All the files and everything that's in there, they go into that archive, right?
That is correct.